They even went so far as to say that she had an affair with two of her brothers-in-law. One of them was Ferdinand of Bulgaria, the brother of her husband. The other, none other than Rudolph, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne and husband of her sister Stephanie. But of course, that was nothing more than what malicious tongues whispered in the corridors of royalty. What is known for certain is that the life of this princess was far from a fairy tale. From her birth, surrounded by the wealth of the royal palace of Belgium, as the daughter of the feared and relentless King Leopold II, until her sorrowful end, her story unfolded more like the script of a melodrama. And not just any melodrama, one filled with betrayals, scandals, escapes, and unexpected twists. Throughout her life, she became entangled in forbidden romances, abandoned her husband for a lover, endured the scorn of the aristocracy, and even escaped from an asylum. And the most astonishing part is not the escape itself, but rather how she came to be locked away in such a dark and somber place. The life of Louise Marie of Belgium was anything but monotonous. And if you want to uncover the details and how this story truly ends, stay with us until the very end of this video. I promise you will not regret it. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and share your thoughts about this princess who shocked all of Europe. Today, you are going to discover the scandalous life of Louise Marie of Belgium. The birth of Louise Marie Amélie of Belgium was as eagerly awaited as it was deeply disappointing. Granddaughter of King Leopold I and the first daughter of the future Leopold II with Marie Henriette, Louise was born on February 18, 1858, at the Royal Palace of Brussels. Her birth should have been a cause for celebration, a milestone for the Belgian dynasty, which was still in the process of consolidating itself. But when the infant was placed in her mother's arms, there were no smiles of joy. She was a girl, and the monarchy had no need for a princess. They had been expecting an heir, a successor, someone who could guarantee the continuity of the bloodline without the need for complicated arrangements in the future. But instead, Louise was born. The story of her parents was already a sign that her childhood would not be filled with affection. The marriage of Leopold II and Marie Henriette was nothing more than a political arrangement, a game of interests carefully crafted by Leopold I and by the Habsburgs. Neither of them had ever wanted this union. Leopold II was consumed by the political and economic affairs of Belgium, as well as by his mistresses, while Marie Henriette, an Austrian archduchess devoted to her passions, preferred horses and music over matters of state. They were as different as they were unhappy, and the birth of their daughter did nothing to bring them closer. On the contrary, the wish that the baby had been a boy was not only about ensuring the continuation of the dynasty, but also about freeing the parents from the obligation of sharing the same bed. Even so, Louise Marie received all the honors expected of a princess. Her baptism, celebrated on March 28, 1858, was graced by illustrious godparents, Archduke John of Austria, her great-uncle, and the exiled Queen Maria Amelia, widow of King Louis Philippe of France. Even as a baby, Louise was already being observed and judged by royalty. Her own father, Leopold II, made a point of recording his first impressions of his daughter. She is very clever. Her face is pale and rosy like her mother's. King Leopold I finds her very beautiful. I hope she will be one day, but for now, I have only noticed that she has large dark eyes and, alas, an enormous nose, in every sense worthy of mine. Louise was not the couple's only child. 1 year later, on June 12, 1859, the long-awaited heir, Leopold, was born. Now at last, the Belgian monarchy could breathe a sigh of relief. The birth of the boy brought pride to the royal family, while Louise became merely the eldest daughter, the princess without a clear role, living in the shadow of her brother. Later, On May 21st, 1864, her sister Stephanie was born, and her destiny, like that of Louise, would prove to be deeply troubled. She would become the wife of Rudolf, heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in a marriage that ended in tragedy and one of the greatest scandals of European royalty. The childhood of Louise, therefore, unfolded in a cold and distant environment. She grew up between parents who could hardly stand each other and a brother who was the center of all attention. Despite the rigidity of the court, there were still moments of lightness. Louise grew close to some of her cousins, forming a small circle of friendship within European aristocracy. Among them were Maria Christina of Austria, who would later become Queen of Spain, and Beatrice of Great Britain, daughter of the powerful Queen Victoria. The girls would spend long hours together in the gardens of the Palace of Laeken, sharing childhood games and secrets. When apart, Louise exchanged short letters with her cousins. Yet if she found some refuge in her social relationships, her education was marked by severe discipline and a limited curriculum. From the age of 6, she was taught at home by carefully selected tutors, with lessons in French, English, German, and Italian. Mathematics was taught only in the most basic form, while subjects such as history, religion, and music played a more central role. But the main focus was on the recreational arts, painting, drawing, music, and embroidery, considered more appropriate for a princess. The discipline imposed by her mother, Queen Marie Henriette, was relentless. Raised under the rigidity of the English style, Louise and her sisters grew up in austerity and restraint, in a cold and loveless environment. Louise herself would later write about that period. Our rooms were more like convent cells than princely apartments. The Queen taught me from a very young age to live without servants. With her father, Leopold II, the relationship was even more distant. He never hid his lack of interest in his daughters, showing almost no attention to anything that did not involve the political and economic future of Belgium. Louise would remember the king as a silent and intimidating figure, whose displays of affection were exceedingly rare. And it was in this atmosphere of repression and frustrated expectations that Louise Marie grew up. Perhaps it was precisely this absence of affection, this harsh upbringing filled with rules, that awakened in her a rebellious, daring, and non-conforming spirit. A spirit that years later would lead her to break away from the traditions of the court and to scandalize the European nobility. Little did her parents know, while they tried to mold her into an exemplary princess, that they were raising a woman who would never accept living bound by the rules of the monarchy. In the spring of 1868, the life of the Belgian royal family was struck by a tragedy that would forever change young Louise. Her brother Leopold, nearly 9 years old, caught a severe cold after falling into the lake of the palace park. What first seemed like a passing illness soon revealed itself to be something far more serious: acute pericarditis, a dangerous inflammation of the heart. At first there was hope. During the summer, Leopold showed signs of recovery, yet his persistent cough worried the doctors. In an attempt to relieve the symptoms, he was subjected to surgery. Meanwhile, Marie Henriette sought refuge in a spa, unable to bear the anguish of her son's illness. Leopold II, preoccupied with affairs of state, remained in Laeken with his daughters. But fate was cruel. By August, young Leopold, now suffering from dropsy, saw his condition worsen rapidly, and the Queen, devastated, refused to leave his bedside. In December, the young prince received the last sacraments, and for a brief moment he seemed to recover. But the improvement was only an illusion. The inevitable happened. On January 22, 1869, little Leopold died. For Louise, this was the first great rupture of her life. The death of her brother, her childhood companion, and the future king of Belgium struck her profoundly. The sorrow of this loss spread throughout the family. With the death of the heir, the Belgian throne would pass to Prince Philipp, Count of Flanders, Louise's paternal uncle, and the brother of Leopold II. The king, desperate for a legitimate heir, could not accept the idea of passing the crown to his brother and his descendants. So he resumed his marital life with Marie Henriette, determined to father another son. But in March of 1871, a miscarriage shattered those expectations. Finally, on July 30th, 1872, another child was born. Yet once again, it was a disappointment. It was not the longed-for son, but another girl, Clementine, the last daughter of the royal couple. Louise, now without her brother and surrounded by an atmosphere of mourning, coldness, and despair, felt increasingly alone within the palace walls. The relationship between her parents, already distant and dysfunctional, deteriorated even further. Each blamed the other for the death of their son. The tragedy of Leopold's death not only destroyed the hopes of the monarchy, but also marked a turning point in Louise's life. From then on, she came to see the court as an oppressive place, incapable of offering her any kind of comfort or affection. The young princess began to realize that in her family, love and happiness were rare treasures, and she promised herself that one day, when the opportunity arose, she would do everything in her power to escape that gilded prison. By the age of 14, Louise was already attracting the attention of European princes. Beyond her pleasant appearance, her father, Leopold II, was known as a wealthy monarch, which made her a highly sought-after match. For a time, there was fear that she might be promised to the imperial prince of France, the son of Napoleon III. But the fall of the French Empire soon put an end to that possibility. Two other candidates emerged, Prince Frederick of Hohenzollern and Prince Philipp of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha Coheri, a first cousin of her father. Philippe quickly became the favorite, thanks to his fortune, his powerful family connections, and the support of Queen Marie Henriette, who saw in him a valuable link to Hungary. Louise had no say in her arranged marriage to Philippe, who was 14 years older than she was. She was simply informed of the decision, and yet she accepted without resistance, feeling a certain familiarity with him from earlier visits. The engagement was announced on March 25, 1874, but the wedding did not take place until February 4, 1875, at the Royal Palace of Brussels. Before the ceremony, there were intense financial negotiations, as Leopold II wanted to minimize his daughter's dowry as much as possible. Louise entered the marriage with the naivete of a young woman raised under rigid moral principles, with no knowledge of what awaited her in married life. But on the very night of her wedding, her illusions were brutally shattered. After a grand ball held in her honor, Louise and Philip went to the castle of Laeken, where what should have been a celebration of love turned into a traumatic fiasco. Years later, she would recall the experience with bitterness. "I fell from heaven onto a bed of stones covered with thorns." The pain and the shock were so intense that at dawn, she fled into the castle park and hid in the orangery. A guard spotted her and rushed to alert the court. Queen Marie Henriette appeared quickly, trying to console her daughter, while at the same time reminding her of her duties as a wife. The couple then left for their honeymoon before heading to their official residence in Vienna, the Palais Coburg. It was during that journey that Philippe's true behavior began to reveal itself. Every evening, at the obligatory social events, he would intoxicate Louise with strong wines before subjecting her to erotic readings. The young princess, who had entered that marriage with naive hopes, soon discovered that she was bound to a husband who was coarse and insensitive. Thus, the story of Louise Marie of Belgium, already marked by the traumas and disappointments of childhood, was beginning a far darker chapter, a marriage that would soon become a living nightmare. On March 15, 1875, she arrived at her new residence and immediately felt a deep sense of revulsion. Her new home, far from being a fairy tale castle, seemed more like a gloomy museum, where everything was controlled by her husband, Philippe, and by her mother-in-law, Princess Clémentine of Orléans. Clémentine, a woman of strong character and possessive instincts, imposed her will without hesitation. At only 17 years old, Louise could not adapt to this new life. a marriage that had begun without love quickly turned into a battlefield of constant conflict. Philip treated his wife as his property. Failing to understand her resistance, he tried to mold her to his desires. He forced her to read erotic books and flaunted his collection of sensual art from Japan, hoping to awaken in her a sexuality that she firmly rejected. But Louise was not a submissive woman. Finding no refuge at home, she threw herself into Vienna's social life. She spent fortunes, frequented aristocratic salons, and with her beauty and charisma, attracted admirers while scandalizing society with her defiant attitude. With a sharp eye and an innate talent for satire, she ridiculed her noble acquaintances, creating enemies and earning a reputation as an extravagant woman. Despite being emotionally estranged, Louise and Philippe had 2 children, Leopold Clement, born on July 19, 1878, and Dorothea, born in April 1881. But not even the birth of their children was enough to unite the couple, who continued to argue constantly. Over time, Louise withdrew from her maternal duties, and the children were raised separately under the care of tutors and governesses. As her married life grew increasingly miserable, she formed a close friendship with Archduke Rudolph of Austria, heir to the throne, son of Emperor Franz Joseph, and the iconic Empress Sisi. They were the same age, shared a rebellious spirit, and soon became close companions. It was Louise who encouraged Rudolph to marry her younger sister, Stephanie, a union that was sealed on May 10, 1881. But her mother, Marie Henriette, disapproved of this friendship. Before Stephanie's marriage, she warned her daughter sternly, "Avoid Louise, and if you see her, argue with her. Set her a good example. Louise is not sincere. She lies and acts with ease. She is very frivolous." Ironically, Stephanie's marriage would prove to be even more unhappy than Louise's. Meanwhile, Louise continued defying the norms and living life on her own terms. But this boldness would come at a cost, and the following years of her life would be marked by even greater scandals. Trapped in a loveless marriage, she began applying the erotic lessons forced upon her by her husband, but now with other men. In 1883, she began an affair with a baron who served as Philippe's aide-de-camp. The scandal soon reached the ears of Queen Marie Henriette, who tried unsuccessfully to separate them. The relationship only ended when the baron died, but another quickly took his place, the young Baron Nicholas Dory. Nicholas became an inseparable part of the Coburg household, even accompanying the couple on their travels across Europe. Philip realized far too late that he had lost his wife, and he turned to the Queen for help in separating Louise from her lover. But that romance would last for a full decade, only ending in 1893, when Nicholas Dory married another woman, leaving Louise completely heartbroken. Perhaps disillusioned by this final betrayal, Louise attempted a brief reconciliation with Philip in 1894. Seeking to escape the scandals, she traveled to Egypt. Though initially bored, she soon became fascinated by the country. Yet the marital crisis was beyond repair. By the end of the year, she sought comfort in her children, giving the impression of some stability. But in truth, it was nothing more than a temporary truce. Still greater scandals were yet to come, because the man who would make Louise lose her head entirely was about to enter her life. In May 1895, during a walk in Vienna, she met the Croatian Count Mattachich, a young officer 9 years her junior, who would become both the great love of her life and her ultimate downfall. From the very first encounter, Louise was captivated by him. She began returning daily to the same spot where they had first met, hoping to see him again. She also frequented the opera, knowing she might cross paths with him there. The following year, by then promoted to first lieutenant of the Imperial Regiment, Geza traveled to the Austrian Riviera. There he learned that Louise was also in the city. Introduced to her formally during a ball, the passion between them ignited at once. In love and determined, Louise entrusted him with the management of her stables and asked him to give her riding lessons. ensuring his constant presence. By the spring of 1896, Geza was no longer just her lover, but also her financial administrator. The affair soon became the talk of the court, and Emperor Franz Joseph himself decided to intervene. He summoned Louise and issued a stern warning, reminding her that she was still a married woman and must separate from the Count. He advised her to travel abroad and even forbade her attendance at the imperial court ball. It was the final sentence. Louise was banished from aristocracy. From that moment on, as Count Geza himself later wrote in his memoirs, she was nothing more than a fallen woman, left without any support. In January 1897, Louise Marie of Belgium caused a tremendous scandal in Vienna when she abandoned her husband, Prince Philipp of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha Kohari, to run away with Count Count Mattachich. She took her daughter Dorothea with her and began a wandering life, first in Paris and Cannes, and later traveling across different destinations in the south of France and other parts of Europe. Yet this decision carried a heavy personal cost. Her son, Leopold Clement of Belgium, with whom her relationship was already strained, distanced himself even further from her. He believed that his mother's reckless behavior had ruined his prospects of inheritance, and with it, his future within the European aristocracy. The scandal of Louise's flight spread across all of Europe. In response, her mother, Marie Henriette, and her father, King Leopold II, cut ties with her completely, and even forbade her sister Stephanie from seeing her. Louise Marie was no longer welcome in Belgium. The climax of this scandal came on February 18, 1898, when her husband Philippe, under pressure from Emperor Franz Joseph, challenged her lover to a duel in a desperate attempt to defend his honor. The confrontation was violent, but ultimately inconclusive. After 2 failed pistol shots, the rivals clashed with sabers, during which Philip suffered a light wound to his hand. Following the duel, Count Geza fled to Nice to rejoin Louise, while Philip, humiliated and furious, began working to destroy his wife's reputation. His first move was to separate her from her daughter Dorothea, sending the girl away to another city. But his troubles did not end there. To his despair, creditors came knocking at his door incessantly, demanding payment for the enormous debts accumulated by Louise, debts that, as her legal husband, he was obligated to cover. The task was impossible. She had squandered fortunes on her extravagant lifestyle and on her lover. Philippe implored his father-in-law, King Leopold II, for financial help, but the Belgian monarch refused to pay a single penny. In the end, it was Emperor Franz Joseph who reluctantly agreed to settle the debts. But this act destroyed his relationship with the Belgian king. The net was closing around Louise. Just weeks after the duel, Philip and Emperor Franz Joseph decided to separate her from Count Geza once and for all. They declared that she was insane and threatened her with confinement in a psychiatric hospital. Louise was given 2 options: return to the Coburg Palace and reconcile with her husband, or be institutionalized. She chose the latter and was committed to an asylum near Vienna, where she was kept in strict isolation from the other patients. While Louise was held in confinement, Count Mattachich was arrested and accused of forging financial documents in her name and that of her sister Stephanie. Whether the charges were false and fabricated merely to ruin him is uncertain. What is known is that in January 1899 he was convicted and sent to a military prison. By then, Princess Louise had already been officially declared insane and confined in a madhouse. From that moment on, Louise became an invisible prisoner. In November 1898, she was transferred to a sanatorium where the conditions were less severe. Yet her situation remained precarious. Without any support from her family, she spent years forgotten in psychiatric institutions. The press, however, did not relent. Louise's case dominated the headlines, and to Philippe's despair, Austrian newspapers began to take her side. The pressure on him increased, and he feared that his position within the empire would soon become untenable. Cornered, he made a drastic decision: To preserve his reputation, Louise had to be removed completely. She would be sent far away, beyond the borders of the empire. On June 17, 1899, she was transferred to a new sanatorium in Saxony, the Lindenhof in Coswig. There, at least, she was given access to a private villa and lived with a lady-in-waiting and a maid. But her children never visited, and her family abandoned her entirely. While Louise languished in the sanatorium, Count Geza did not give up on her. But in prison, he met Maria Stöger, a young married woman who had become fascinated with him after reading about the scandal in the press. So captivated was she that she sought employment in the penitentiary simply to be near him. And when she finally met him in person behind bars, her passion only deepened. Maria became Geza's lover, and with the help of lawyers, launched a campaign to secure his release. After 2 relentless years of effort, on August 27, 1902, he was pardoned and set free. Determined to rescue Louise, Count Geza, who had just been interviewed by a French journalist, asked the reporter for help. He offered him an extraordinary bargain: exclusive rights to Louise's story, in exchange for the financial support needed to carry out her escape from the sanatorium. Geza revealed to the journalist his daring plan to free her, and together they began making preparations for the dramatic rescue. First, Geza published his memoirs under the provocative title Insane for Reasons of State. In it, he recounted the princess's unhappy childhood, her forced marriage, and the persecution she endured at the Vienna's court. He portrayed Louise as a victim of aristocratic intrigues, unjustly imprisoned for daring to defy the rigid rules of the monarchy. The book, later translated into French, had little impact in Europe and was immediately banned in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Finally, on August 31, 1904, Count Geza put his audacious plan into action. During a treatment in Saxony, where the supervision was less strict, he helped Louise escape. Louise was deeply saddened at having to leave behind her beloved little dog, who had been her loyal companion during her confinement. But that was not her only regret. Of course, she was overjoyed to see her beloved Geza come bravely to rescue her, but it was a bittersweet moment. It was nothing like the fairy tales she had dreamed of. Instead of her knight arriving on a white horse to save his lady, Geza appeared accompanied by his other lover, the very woman he had met in prison, who now refused to leave his side. Louise had no time to demand explanations. The 3 of them fled together to France, taking refuge at the Westminster Hotel in Paris. The scandal was immediate. The Belgian royal family reacted with outrage. Louise's aunt, the Countess of Flanders, wrote to her daughter Henriette describing the episode as something unbelievable, adding that Louise had no idea of her own future. Henriette responded with biting sarcasm. Louise Coburg's escape is nothing more than a gloomy tragicomedy. That woman of 46, withered and mad, carried off in an automobile paid for by a French journalist. What followed marked yet another turning point in her life. In 1905, the French courts declared Louise mentally sane, shattering the narrative constructed by Philippe and the Austrian court. With this judgment, her husband proposed an amicable divorce, offering her a monthly pension of 7,000 Austro-Hungarian crowns. The process was finalized on January 15, 1906, officially ending their marriage. Now, Louise was divorced and free from her husband. But that freedom came at a high price. Accustomed to a life of luxury, she quickly fell into debt. To maintain her extravagant lifestyle, she wandered across Europe, constantly fleeing creditors, always accompanied by Geza, and still, at times, by his other lover. Geza continued his relationship with Maria Stöger, but over time, the affair deteriorated, and by 1907, she no longer lived with them. Almost immediately, he began yet another romance, this time with Louise's own lady-in-waiting, Anna von Gebauer. As one might expect, the tensions between Geza and Louise grew more intense. But that was not her only problem. The financial crisis worsened dramatically. In November 1907, Louise discovered that her jewels, inherited from her mother, Marie Henriette, who had died in 1902, were being auctioned off to pay debts. Soon afterward, she learned that even her clothing had been sold in Vienna. And when King Leopold II died, in December 1909, Louise Marie of Belgium returned to her homeland. But she did not return to be welcomed by her family or honored as the daughter of the monarch. No, she was forced to remain on the sidelines, excluded even from the official mourning of the king. Her years of scandals and exile had already stained her reputation. But the true blow came when Louise and her sisters discovered the contents of King Leopold II's will. The king, infamous not only for his political coldness, but also for his cruelty in the Congo, left nothing of his immense fortune to his daughters. Much of the vast wealth of the Belgian monarchy, built on the blood of millions of exploited Africans, fell instead into the hands of the most unlikely figure of all, the king's mistress, Caroline Lacroix, a young French prostitute whom he had elevated to the title of Baroness of Vaughan. Leopold II, the very man who had disinherited Louise for her romantic choices, handed over his fortune to his mistress, and it was not just that. He also hid much of his wealth in shell companies in France and Germany, preventing his own daughters from accessing what was rightfully theirs. Whether it was out of vengeance or pure selfishness, we will never know. But Louise, who had already been humiliated and abandoned, would not accept such a fate without a fight. While her sisters Stephanie and Clementine agreed to settle for 2 million francs each, Louise refused to be bought. For her, this was not merely about money. It was about justice, about claiming what was hers by right. In December 1910, she launched her first lawsuit against the Belgian state and astonishingly against her own sisters. But that was only the beginning. In April 1911, she opened a second lawsuit, this time targeting directly the secret companies her father had created in France, companies he had used to conceal his fortune. The rejected daughter, the rebellious princess, was now standing alone against an empire. But she was not entirely alone. Her sister Stephanie, who had also been cast aside by their father, decided to join the fight. Together the two sought support in the courts, defended by some of the most respected lawyers in Belgian justice. The government, however, was not willing to yield. In April 1913, the Court of Appeal in Brussels rejected the princess's claims. Once again, Louise lost, but she refused to surrender. On January 22, 1914, at last, an agreement was signed between Louise, the Belgian state, and her creditors. She received a little over 5 million francs from her father's estate, a sum greater than what had been offered initially. Was it a victory? Perhaps. 5 million francs was certainly more than the 2 million originally proposed. But compared to the vast fortune that should have rightfully gone to the daughters of the man remembered by history as the butcher of the Congo, it was a meager sum. Leopold II had been merciless not only with Africa, but also with his own children. Before his death, he ensured that most of his wealth would be left to one person, his mistress, Blanche de Lacroix, the Baroness of Vaughan. But who was this woman? To whom did Leopold II bequeath his blood-stained fortune? The story of Blanche de Lacroix began in Paris, where she was known as Caroline Lacroix. When she met Leopold II, she was barely 16 years old, while the king was already past 65. Caroline was working as a prostitute in the French capital, and the monarch, utterly infatuated with her, made her his official mistress. But it was not enough for him simply to keep her. Leopold went further. He granted her a noble title, transforming her into the Baroness of Vaughan. And to keep the affair somewhat concealed from the eyes of the court, Leopold had a secret passage built between his apartments and Blanche's, allowing him to visit her discreetly. In truth, however, the scandal was an open secret. Soon Blanche was mockingly nicknamed the Queen of the Congo because of the enormous sums she received from the king. And what did she do with all that money? She squandered it on endless parties, lavish clothing, and a life of excess. In the final days of his life, Leopold sought to legitimize his mistress once and for all. Just 5 days before his death, he married her. But the ceremony held no legal value in Belgium, for it lacked civil registration, a requirement essential for the marriage to be officially recognized. The consequences were devastating for Blanche. The Belgian courts annulled the marriage, and Leopold II's 3 daughters tried to recover part of the fortune left by their father. But Blanche acted quickly. With the help of Antoine Durieux, her true lover and former pimp, she stole essential documents that secured her control over the king's fortune and managed to hide it from the members of the royal family. 7 months after the death of Leopold II, Blanche married Durieux, the man who had once been her pimp and with whom she had maintained a relationship throughout the years she was the king's mistress. But the marriage did not last long. They divorced shortly afterward, and Blanche was forced to pay a large sum of money to Antoine in order to secure custody of her 2 children. And so it was that while Leopold's daughters received almost nothing from their father's inheritance, a Parisian prostitute and her pimp were the ones who truly enjoyed the wealth of the Belgian crown. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Louise and Geza were living at the Park Hotel in Vienna. But the war brought yet another cruel blow to Louise's destiny. As the daughter of Leopold II and a member of a family connected to several European royal houses, she immediately became persona non grata within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The authorities expelled her from imperial territory, and Louise attempted to return to Belgium. But the turmoil of the war prevented her from going beyond Munich. There, she and Geza spent 2 years struggling to survive amid the chaos consuming Europe. Tragedy struck again in April 1916, when her son Leopold, who had severed all ties with his mother, died in a brutal and scandalous manner. And if you want to know what happened to him, I will leave a link in the description of this video. It was a case that shocked all of Europe. Only a few months later, her beloved Geza was arrested by order of the Austrian government, accused of conspiring against the empire because of his Croatian origins. He was sent to a prisoner camp near Budapest, and Louise, now completely alone, once again fell into misery. With no money and no support, she was forced to sell what little remained of her jewels in order to survive. She had to abandon the Park Hotel and move into a far more modest one. By early 1917, her debts had already reached 30 million marks. Louise was reduced to living in a humble boarding house, surviving only on the occasional charity of her daughter Dorothea and her sister Stephanie. After the end of the war and the liberation of Belgium, Louise saw what little she had left confiscated by the Belgian government. With no other options and no support whatsoever from her royal family, she decided to write her memoirs as a way of earning money. Her book, Around the Thrones I Once Saw Fall, was published in 1921 in Paris. That same year, her former husband Philip died in Coburg, but Louise was entirely excluded from his inheritance. From 1920 onward, she had tried to return to Belgium, but her presence in the country was deemed unacceptable. The Belgian government feared public unrest if Louise returned, since her ties to the Austro-Hungarian Empire still wounded the national pride. And yet, despite everything, Louise and Count Geza remained together until his death. By then, the couple was living in a modest hotel in Paris, far removed from the days of luxury and scandal. On October 1st, 1923, Geza died of uremia, worsened by heart problems. Now, Louise was completely alone. Without money and rejected by the royal family, the Belgian consul general suggested that she settle in Wiesbaden, Germany, with the support of the Belgian queen consort, Elizabeth of Bavaria, who wished to help her. She moved into the Hotel Nassau, where she spent her final months in solitude, accompanied only by a lady-in-waiting and a maid. Her health declined rapidly, and by February 1924, she was suffering from severe circulatory problems. On March 1st, 1924, one of her few remaining friends realized she was on the verge of death. He hurried to find a priest, but by the time he returned, Louise had already passed away. She was 66 years old. 3 days later, she was laid to rest in Wiesbaden's southern cemetery without pomp or grandeur, in a discreet ceremony. Not a single member of the royal family attended her funeral. The Belgian court declared 1 month of mourning, but the truth was that Louise had long since been forgotten. And so ended the story of the princess who dared to defy her destiny. The woman who abandoned royalty in pursuit of love and freedom, but who paid the ultimate price, a life of solitude and oblivion. Her tomb, far from Belgium, bears only a simple inscription: "Here rests in God, Louise, Princess of Belgium." A silent reminder of a life that was anything but ordinary.